It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Whenever a foreign government tries to interfere in an election, that's desperation.
That relationship between the US and the UK will continue whoever is elected president, but it really is up to individuals to choose how they spend their own money and their own time.
The Trump campaign accuses the Labour Party of interfering in the US elections. The West wanted him isolated, so why is Vladimir Putin playing host to the leaders of the world's biggest countries? And now the UN Secretary-General has turned up in Russia too.
I think it's disrespectful to the members and the public to ask for their votes without saying where you stand.
If this was a general election, yes, it would be wrong to be standing with no policies. This is not a general election.
Tory leadership contenders clash about their policies or the lack of them. And Metropolitan Police Chief Mark Rowley calls for a change in the law after the acquittal of one of his firearms officers on murder charges. Joining us today, Conservative MP Jessie Norman, Labour MP Marie Tidball, Naomi Smith of the pro-EU think tank Best for Britain, and Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery. This is Politics Live. Welcome. Let's start with this headline in The Times. Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, to vote against assisted dying bill. This is a bill that will come before the Commons later this year, in fact, next month. It is a free vote, which means MPs can vote with their conscience and not along party lines. Let me read you the headline underneath. The Health Secretary says palliative care isn't good enough for patients to make an informed choice. Marie, do you agree with him? Is he right?
So for me, this is about compassionate choice at the end of life. I will be listening very carefully to what my constituents believe, but I will also be looking at this from the perspective of someone who's worked in disability rights for over 10 years and wanting to make sure that they have a dignified choice. And that includes a number of tests, how we define terminal illness, the quality and availability of good enough palliative and end-of-life care, and also what the medical profession are saying about this and how it is put in place in practice.
What do you make of the fact that Wes Streeting has actually come out this early to say clearly where he stands on this issue because he doesn't think palliative care is good enough?
Well, as you said right at the beginning, this is a matter of conscience for each individual MP. I will be looking very closely at the ability of palliative care to be preserved in a context where other colleagues are suggesting we introduce assisted dying, and that will be one of the most important things for me. So it will be amongst a range of evidence that I'll look at in making my decision.
Do you agree with him, Naomi, with Wes Streeting?
I think that the alternative to legalising assisted dying is that people can die in pain and distress, and no matter how good the palliative care, that will always happen for some people. So I think giving people the choice in a dignified way about how they end their life is to be welcomed, and it is hugely popular. Polling after polling over many years shows that 75% of the population support it, including 69% of Christians and 75% of disabled people. I think it's right that it's a free vote. I think there should be more free votes in the House of Commons. Actually, I think the whip system does our democracy a disservice at times. So it is right that it is a free vote, but I do personally support it.
What do you make, Tim, of Wes Streeting's decision to say what he said now?
Really welcome it. I'm probably going to damn him now, but I have a lot of admiration for Wes Streeting. He does seem to think for himself. And you know, Parliament's remembered for all sorts of pieces of legislation. You know, the 1967 Abortion Act, David Cameron's time in office would be remembered for sort of gay marriage in part. This is going to be one of the defining decisions that this Parliament takes. And for the Health Secretary to say he doesn't think that we can take this decision before we improve palliative care, I think is a big intervention in this. And I disagree respectfully with Naomi on this. I think the danger of giving someone a right to die is that for other people it becomes a duty to die. And there are plenty of people in this country at the moment who already feel a burden to their families and to society. And at the moment, by keeping the law as it is, we are saying to those people, we are going to care for you, we're not going to kill you. We don't want you to feel under any pressure to leave this world. And I think we have a very British fudge at the moment. If someone does is involved in a mercy killing. The police investigate it, but they understand the motivation. I think once we have legalised a right to die, in inverted commas, I think we do put an awful lot of pressure on disabled people, very ill people, in a way that changes the nature of people's relationship with the state. So this is a grave matter. I understand the strongly held views on both sides, but I really do welcome what Wes Streeting has said today.
Jesse Norman, where are you and what do you make of what Wes Streeting has done and said?
Well, I think a lot of what's been said is very sensible today. I think Wes has taken a big step into the public arena on this issue. He's obviously concerned in part, I would say, about the impact on medical professionals. I don't think that's necessarily been fully explored. I personally have other worries. I'm going to be listening to the debate and reading the legislation carefully. I'm surprised there wasn't a white paper exploring some of these issues first. I mean, let me give you some examples. Supply of drugs, the kinds of drugs that would be used, the existence of a separate service that people have discussed to try to provide this, concerns about the record of cases where assisted dying hasn't worked and the person has died very unhappily over a longer period or has not died at all at that moment. I mean, there's just a lot of doubt and detail here, which I think, personally, parliamentarians will want to have. I'm surprised they brought this forward as quickly as they have, because it really does need a bit more public digestion and debate within and around Parliament.
Right, well, it certainly has, I think, generally been a surprise that it's going to be debated so soon. And you personally, have you made up your mind?
No, I mean, I think everyone here will have had members of their family who have been subject to Alzheimer's or dementia and had very difficult issues in their own life. Goodness knows I have. And so one feels the pressure on both sides of that argument. And that's why I think the detail is so important, and thinking through all of the provisions of the proposals that might be made for how this service would be brought into existence if it was, who would run it, how it relates to the existing medical suppressions, etc. I think there's a whole series of issues there that really haven't been properly addressed.
Well, we have discussed this at length before, and we will no doubt do so again before it is actually brought for debate in the House of Commons. Let me just show you all this headline, BBC News extraordinary story. Trump's team accuses Labour of election interference as Starmer tries to play down row. Let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman. What's going on, Henry?
Well, this is a fascinating story which almost sort of came out of nowhere. And if you want me to explain where it began, it actually began on LinkedIn. Somewhat to my surprise, an interesting thing happening there. A post from Sophia Patel. She's the head of operations at the Labour Party. And she said to her professional network, I have nearly 100 Labour Party staff, current and former, going to the US in the next few weeks, heading to a variety of swing states, essentially. She said she had 10 spots available for anyone who was willing to go and campaign in North Carolina. Now, that was taken by the Trump campaign as evidence that the Labour Party was essentially providing campaigners to the Democratic presidential campaign, to Kamala Harris. That is something the Labour Party adamantly denies. They say that this was an official from the Labour Party in a private capacity arranging for volunteers, also in a private capacity, to go out there to the United States. But clearly it has resulted, for now at least, in this extraordinary diplomatic spat.
Now, there is and has been a tradition to some extent of volunteers from all political parties going out to help campaigns off their own back. So why has this blown up into such a diplomatic row?
You're absolutely right to talk about the tradition, Joe. I think every 4 years, Brits flock across the Atlantic to go and work on both campaigns, Democratic and Republican. You know, the truth is that almost everyone in this place, and I include myself in that, is obsessed with American politics. It's mostly an unrequited passion, but nevertheless, it is one that is true across journalists, politicians,
no less.
and all sorts of people in the UK. I think this one has taken off for a couple of reasons. I think one is just that post does seem to raise questions, even if they are answered in the way that the Labour Party says, that they weren't involved, that this is all volunteer stuff. Clearly some of the language was at the very least injudicious once it's blown up and questions are asked of it. But also the view of people at the top of the Labour Party is that this is the Trump campaign using this as a way to sort of bash the Harris campaign in that crucial final fortnight. If they're right about that, then they can relax and begin the diplomatic work of working with President Trump if he wins the election. If they're wrong about that, though, and this is something more serious, something more diplomatically concerning, well, it could threaten the most important relationship that any Prime Minister has.
Right, and how about the reaction from Number 10 and Keir Starmer? What's been their response, the sort of tone of it?
They're very much trying to play it down. They are saying these are volunteers working in a voluntary capacity. You know, they're pointing to the numerous times, and it really is too many to count, that Keir Starmer has failed to rise to efforts from people like me to try to get him to declare who he would like to win the presidential election, and has simply said that he would be willing to work with whoever the American people choose. Of course, it was just a couple of weeks ago that Keir Starmer was in New York having dinner with Donald Trump. That was the first time they'd met. I don't think he's actually ever met Kamala Harris, Keir Starmer, but they have put a lot of effort, not just Keir Starmer, but also David Lammy, his Foreign Secretary, into making alliances, or at the very least just acquaintances, with senior people from Trump's campaign and sort of the Trump world, if you will. But evidently, this is a serious spanner in the works.
Right, Henry Zeffman, thank you very much. Yes, and perhaps escalated even further if we show this to our guests, and I'll come to you first, Marie, from Dillon Law Group, writing about a complaint against the Labour Party of the United Kingdom and Harris for president for making and accepting illegal foreign national contributions. So it's got to the sort of legal stage. I'll read you part of it. When representatives of the British government previously sought to go door to door in America, it did not end well for them. This past week marked the 243rd anniversary of the surrender of British forces at the Battle of Yorktown, a military victory that ensured that the United States would be politically independent of Great Britain. It appears the Labour Party and the Harris for President campaign have forgotten the message. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, I can't comment on a legal case which, may well have been initiated. The point that is important to make is one that you and Henry both said at the beginning, that these are volunteers. They are individuals that are going out. There's no sense that the Labour Party has funded any of this or has been involved in that whatsoever. And I think what's really key for us to remember, and Henry again in his piece made it very clear, that Keir Starmer has met with Trump. He met recently in New York. And at the centre of that is our very special relationship and historic ties with the US and our close allyship. And the fact that we recognise how important that relationship is, and it's in the best interests of the UK people. But most of all, we have to remember that actually we are two nations that have a rich shared history in democratic principles that go beyond...
Which is being pointed out in this
that go beyond who is in the White House and who is in Number 10
Marie,
Downing Street.
That is all well and good, of course, but it seems that Donald Trump is refusing to take that into account, or at least the Trump campaign. I mean, what do you make of that rather historic and perhaps the Labour government might say hysterical letter?
Well, it's a bit overdone. I think they seem to have forgotten that in, 1796, they signed the Jay Treaty, which brought Britain and America firmly back together again and dished the French, who had supported the American Revolution all the way through. So it seemed to me a slightly odd analogy. No, in this case, you can see why Keir Starmer is going to be embarrassed about it. Right? It feels organisational. It's not like people go to help their mates. It's an organisational thing run by someone who's got a position in the party. Of course, the relationship with the Americans goes much deeper than any of this. I do recall a few years ago when The Guardian tried to get its readers to contact individual voters in Ohio, which was a swing state. I thought if anything could be guaranteed to deliver Ohio for the Republican Party, I'm getting called up by Guardian readers they've never heard of and being read a lesson by the Brits.
Well, I suppose that is a question. Does it work? Does it work, activists from political parties here actually going out to campaign for either Republicans or Democrats?
I mean, fundamentally, this is a democratic decision of the American people, and whatever the outcome of this election, the Prime Minister and the government of this country will work with whoever is elected by the American people.
Right. Should the activists have gone in the first place, do you think?
I mean, that isn't for me to comment. That's about...
If you have a view, should they have gone?
People's individual judgments. And, as my colleague here, Jessie, said, it's a historical thing that parties from both sides have supported both the Democrats and the Republicans going over there. It's a long-standing tradition. It's not for me to comment on people's individual choices.
Well, and interestingly, one of your former colleagues, former Tory MP Robert Buckland and former Minister... Yes, he is. He wrote this: as a Tory, I hope for the world's sake that Kamala Harris wins for the Democrats. What do you make of all this?
Well, as Henry and you have both alluded to, it's not new. And look, we've got Nigel Farage seems to spend far more time over there campaigning with Trump than he does on behalf of the people of Clacton. I think the bigger point is really about that relationship. We could see a second Trump presidency. He is threatening all sorts of things, 20% tariffs on UK imports, his comments about NATO, etc. And I just think this points to ever more volatility and unpredictability, and therefore the UK needs to do what I think it is doing, which is closer ties with Europe. And I think we'll probably be discussing the new UK-Germany Defence Pact, which I think is exactly the right thing for the government to be focusing on in the face of a threat from a Trump presidency.
I mean, do you think it was wrong of them to fly out? And do you think Keir Starmer and the government are handling this in the right way?
I think it's stupid by the Labour Party. Look, I think,
which bit is stupid?
Well, on multiple levels. But
OK.
Look, I think it's probably very likely now that Trump is going to win. The early voting in the States that's being interpreted, the Republicans are cock-a-hoop. They haven't seen turnout in their own areas like it. So the Labour Party have, at the highest level, invested hugely in having a relationship with a possible re-elected President Trump. Henry mentioned the engagement by David Lammy and Keir Starmer himself. So why, when you have done all that, would you allow a director of field operations for the Labour Party to organise, Labour activists, even if it's entirely legal, which I'm sure it is, why would you get Labour activists to try and undermine that? Because we know what Donald Trump is like. He's a prickly person. At the moment, this just seems to be the campaign taking place. We've got no knowledge that Donald Trump is even aware of something that's leading BBC bulletins today. But if he does understand it, he does get a hold of it and he takes offence, he will remember this sort of thing. So it was amateurish, I'm afraid, by the Labour Party. Whatever you think of the politics,
even though it's been done many times before by all sides, it seems.
Indeed, but given how much the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have invested
how much is
in the
at
Trump
stake?
relationship, why would they spoil it or endanger it with this action?
I mean, I think I agree with Jessie on this one, that you're massively overblowing this issue when it is about individuals and volunteers going over there of their own decision. And we are, as you rightly acknowledge, working extremely hard to build those relationships. Whoever ends up being chosen by the American people to be their president.
You say it's volunteers' own decision. This is the Labour Party's Director of Field Operations organising volunteers over there. And why was the message deleted? You don't delete something if you haven't got anything to hide.
I mean, I haven't seen the original post, so that's up to the individual themselves about what they do on their own social media. But the key thing that we must come back to is what's in the best interests of this country. And ultimately, our Labour government are putting those relationships, the important special relationship with the US, right at the top of the agenda and are having those conversations regularly and early on, as you yourself acknowledge.
Well, there's another important contest, of course, happening, and that's the contest to be the next Conservative leader. The result is going to be on November the 2nd. The ballot closes on the 31st of October. But let's have a look at this tweet from our guest here, Jessie Norman. And just to remind you, of course, the two remaining candidates are Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch. I'm very sorry to have to say it, but that speech of Robert Jenrick's, referring to his speech at conference, was lazy, mendacious, simplistic, tripe. That was very delicately put, Jessie.
Look, I didn't know you were going to bring that up, and it was said by me, and I don't retract any of it, but it was said by me in the heat of the moment, and that was because the speech was recycling things that I thought were plainly wrong. So the idea that the ECHR is a remedy for our immigration issues, when in fact we know that immigration has been high because of all of the Ukrainians and Syrians and Afghans and others, Hong Kongers we've brought into this country. The idea that green budgets, the Harbin budgets, are a block to innovation, when in fact, like any budget, they're the exact opposite. They impose a constraint. They stimulate innovation. I thought was wrong, and so I did have a moment there. It was not. I'm a long-time Kemi supporter, but it was not actually said in that light at all. And I didn't check it with her campaign. I just was in the room at the time. Thought this cannot go further. I also think a leadership candidate and a member of Parliament has an obligation to be honest with people, not just in the sense of giving them a partial truth. Neither of these was in fact true, but in the case of giving them a wider context, an honourable accounting for what they were talking about and why. And I think it breached that basic norm as well, and especially in a leadership candidate, personally.
Tim?
Well, in terms of breaching norms, Jesse is one of the gentlemen of the House of Commons, and I was really surprised actually that you tweeted that, Jesse. That was sort of a thing, not sort of thing that I would have expected you to say of a colleague, and you obviously feel it deeply, and I respect that. But I think Robert Jenrick, someone I support in the leadership race, I think he's on a genuine journey, and in a way it's unfortunate for him that this leadership race has happened so early, because I think we're seeing his thinking, evolving thinking, happen in real time, and it perhaps hasn't reached a settled view on everything. But I think he's involved in a genuine search to understand why the Conservative Party lost so catastrophically. I think he's genuinely trying to understand how we repair the rupture on the right with reform, which I think is the biggest challenge in facing the Conservative Party. And I thought it was uncharacteristic of you, Jesse, to be quite so pugilistic towards him, because I think his search, his intellectual inquiry is genuine. And I think one thing, you know, you behave a little bit more like I do, Jesse. I'm a pundit. I sort of speak with punch. I think one thing that does need to be restored in the parliamentary party is that little bit more gentleness, that little bit more sense that we're all on the same team. And I thought that was not how I hope the Conservative MPs will behave.
May I gently nudge back on that? So I mean, my view is remarkably simple, which is I think it's essential to be courteous to each other under all normal circumstances. But there are fundamental norms about the way people behave with each other. And I'll give you an example. So one of them was when I disagreed with David Cameron on the election of the House of Lords, or on the Syria vote. And another one would be when I disagreed with Boris Johnson and wrote a letter.
But this was anger. You were cross, weren't you?
I was cross. And also, I mean, you won't get the point, but I actually criticised the speech rather than the man. It's a move that Tim has made to read across, and an understandable one. I respect all of my colleagues in this, and that's why I thought what was surprising about that was that it fell short of what I would take to be a proper discussion we're having at the top of the Conservative Party about how best to lead this country forward. I wrote an essay the other day on real conservatism that specifically goes into depth analysing the scale of the problem, intellectual, moral, organisational and others, that I think the Conservative Party faces. And that's the place that I would encourage people to look.
You don't regret tweeting it, though, Jesse?
No, I don't regret tweeting
really?
it. No, I really don't.
That's really disappointing.
No, well, I'm sorry to hear that, Tim, but I will say that are there no limits to points where you think a line should be drawn when people are behaving in a way that you would think was
I just don't think that speech came close to crossing a line, and certainly the language you used was very personal.
Do you think his analysis about the ECHR is correct?
I do.
Okay, that's a...
Tim mentioned that Robert Jenrick is on a journey, and in politics the problem is when people are on a journey they sometimes don't stop, they don't arrive, and I think to take us out of the ECHR would put us in the company of Russia and Belarus. And when you've got 50%, half of Conservative councillors saying that they believe neither candidate will actually win the next election, I think this sort of race to out-reform one another with their rhetoric around things is very depressing. And Tim, you mentioned reform being the threat, but the Conservatives are second in 293 seats, of which 219 are held by Labour and just 2 Reform UK, where Reform are in second place in 98 seats. 89 of those are Labour and just 9 are Conservatives. So I do think that the Conservatives, if they want to get a chance at winning at the next election, need to actually tack much further to a broader coalition.
Not as simple as that, though, because if you had a good proportion of the Reform vote in all of those constituencies to the Tory vote, the Tories will win, whereas it's much easier for the Tories to win back Reform voters than any other.
Well, let's listen to the man himself, Robert Jenrick, who spoke to the Westminster Hour about the issue of the European Convention Court on Human Rights and what would happen if he does win to colleagues, if he ever formed a government.
The way to begin to earn back public trust is to be very clear about where we stand on issues. For example, on immigration, whether we want to cap migration or not, whether we want to leave the European Convention on Human Rights or not. I stand for capping migration. I stand for leaving the European Convention on Human Rights and securing our borders as a result. I think it's disrespectful to the members and the public to ask for their votes without saying where you stand on the big issues facing our country today.
Jesse, do you want to respond?
I mean, again, it's very unfortunate that Robert has tied the ECHR into immigration. Those are barely connected, and that's an attempt to mobilise a section of the vote because of that untrue connection. And Tim may want to correct me on this, but actually they really do not have much connection. And we took in 600,000 net migrants over the last, whatever it is, 12 period mentioned. A minuscule proportion of those would have anything to do with the ECHR, if any, since they all came on legal schemes.
He did go on to say in that same interview that if he wins, Conservative Party policy would be to campaign to leave the ECHR, and anyone wanting to stand at a future election would have to back that policy. What would that make you do?
Well, of course, how policy is decided is a matter for the party over time, and the leader can put their views and try and lead a process, but the party ultimately decides it doesn't want to adopt a view, then it won't adopt it. And there have been plenty of hairs run during election campaigns that have turned out not to be real things.
So you don't think he'd win a vote on this within the Conservative Party?
I don't know, but of course the voting in the leadership election doesn't suggest that people have been enormously motivated. Of course, as a matter of the national polling, this issue is way down the list. The thing that people really care about are public services, the NHS, all of those bread and butter issues that actually affect people's lives. Those are the issues that the Conservative Party needs to be very square and strong on.
Right, just before I come to you and we talk about Kemi Badenoch's campaign, Tim, I mean, listening to what Jessie has said in response, does that sound like a divisive policy to already put out there that all MPs and many Conservative MPs don't support the policy of leaving the ECHR? And in fact, I spoke to a former senior Conservative who's no longer an MP at the party conference and said they'd leave the party if that became the policy.
Well, I think it would be a very divisive issue. And if we lost someone like Jessie, despite our disagreement on this issue, I'd be very sad about it. But I think one of the things that perhaps Robert Jenrick is sort of trying to conjure again is, you remember, Jo, when 21 Tory MPs were expelled from the party because they wouldn't back the referendum outcome on Brexit. That was seen by the Westminster Village to be a terrible thing, to lose 21 MPs, many of them grandees of the party, including Ken Clarke. But to the electorate, it signalled that the party was serious about getting out of the European Union and ending the parliamentary stalemate. So there would be ructions if Robert Jenrick, if he became leader, went down that path. But I think it would equally convince the public that at long last there was a Tory leader who was serious about dealing with the problem of immigration, which, despite what Jessie said, I think is connected to immigration, the ECHR, and actually immigration is one of the top issues for the public.
Tim, do you not think that it's slightly odd and possibly supportive of my tweet that Robert's never discussed the relationship in terms of Northern Ireland or any of the impacts that leaving the ECHR would have on that or many other issues, let alone our international relationships, treaties, etc.?
Absolutely.
And he was asked about this.
He was. And, the sanctity of the Good Friday. I grew up in Northern Ireland. I was there during the Troubles as a child. I saw the Good Friday Agreement ending decades of bloodshed. To put that at risk with this rhetoric just to win some votes in order to win the leadership election, I think makes a mockery of the Conservative Party. He shouldn't be doing it, and it's dangerous. And it's dangerous for the Good Friday Agreement. It's dangerous for the UK.
Well, let me get your reaction. Is this something that you would worry about if this became Conservative Party policy? Could it be popular with the public leaving the ECHR?
So Labour have said very clearly that we would not do that, and it's important to make that point. But I think Jessie has reflected on the fact that this is low down the agenda for a lot of voters. And what we have in both of the leadership candidates is people that are not serious about governing, and they are not serious about government. And what they haven't done is go through the process that the Labour Party went through in 2019 to understand why we lost that election. And we heard some of that from Jessie just now. But certainly I haven't heard that from either of those candidates. And it's really clear that they are still embedded in a quagmire of putting party before country. And that isn't where the focus should be, especially after the very grave legacy that they left this country after 14 years of government.
It's not about party or country. The other choice is it's whether you put an international court and an international legal code before the interests of the British people. And if you want to make it an electoral issue, I think the British people will choose the position that Robert Jenrick has taken, which is that he will make sure that if someone is illegally in the UK, they can be extradited. And if a foreign legal code gets in the way of that, then we'll get rid of the foreign legal code. And I think that's the right position for any
let's return to punchy tweets, because, Tim, you have tweeted this about Kemi Badenoch. The people who brought you Rishi Sunak are now recommending Kemi Badenoch. They were wrong then, and they're wrong now. Why?
Well, I think the trouble with Kemi Badenoch is that I understand why you don't want to set out too many of your positions too early on, because you can set out hostages to fortune. But we really don't know where Kemi Badenoch stands on almost anything outside of the culture wars. She's a real culture wars warrior, but I don't think she's been transparent about a whole range of other issues that we face as a country. And so we're effectively handing her a blank cheque if she becomes Tory leader, which I suspect she will become Tory leader. I think that's where the voting probably is in the membership. And I worry that she will be very she'll be very ill positioned to tackle this reform split that we've already touched upon.
Jesse?
I'm afraid I don't agree with that. I think the issue, of course, with reform is that we have to find a way as a party to bring the voters who were disenchanted with the political system and disenchanted with the Conservative Party back into the fray. But that's a much smaller part of the general task, which is to focus on the government, which has applied a dreadful record.
And the lack of policies?
3 months.
Is that a problem?
Well, first of all, I don't accept there is a lack of policy. Right. She's the only candidate who's just published a 40,000-word diagnosis of what's going on. But the point that Marie made is right, which is if you are going through a long-term process of reconstruction and reconsideration, you do not want to be jumping the gun. You want to be setting the terms for a proper public discussion and argument. And I think that having a long leadership contest has been a good idea because it's allowed that process to begin. We need to continue it.
Let's talk about Russia and Vladimir Putin. You saw pictures in the headlines, and we can show you some more from this conference that is underway, international summit that Vladimir Putin has been hosting. You can see there Antonio Guterres has also come into town for this summit, with BRIC countries amongst many, but Antonio Guterres being greeted there. China, India, Brazil, South Africa and emerging nations are all there. So there he is enjoying some cake, I think, there as he's being greeted. But Marie, what's happened to the so-called isolation of Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think the first thing to be said is the sanctions are working. We know that they've raised £400 billion of money that would have otherwise gone to the war in Ukraine, keeping that war going for an estimated 4 years. So they are working. But
he's hardly been frozen out, has he, Vladimir Putin? Here he is surrounded by some of the biggest nations that we have, China and India, and even the UN Secretary-General is attending this summit. It doesn't show that the isolationist policy is working.
But the sanctions are working, and that's really important to note. And it's up to individual countries to, it's their decision to attend.
But the war continues. So are they working?
But it would have continued with much more force for much longer if we didn't have those effective sanctions in place. £400 billion, which, as I say, would have continued that war for a further 4 years. And it's important to note that we are being on the front foot on this in the work that we're doing in the Black Sea. We're linking together with Norway on the Maritime Capability Coalition. That's a really important piece of work to protect that. Not only is it important for Ukraine, but it's important in terms of food security, because at the moment what Russia is doing is stopping that grain going and aid going to parts of the world that need it.
No doubt, there are increasing threats to the world's supply, food supply, grain, as you are talking about. But what I'm trying to get to is those images are quite striking, aren't they, Jesse, when you look at them and you see Antonio Guterres arriving there and being welcomed and hosted by somebody that has been painted, well, by many, as a war criminal.
Listen, I don't really like to comment on these things, but I do not like the look of that for 1 second, and I don't see that it sends anything like the right message. The problem is I mean, I did a lot of the sanctions when I was in government, and we could go further on sanctions. We could go further on punitive actions on key people in and around Russia. We are nothing like serious enough across Europe in supporting Ukraine at the moment. The NATO has still got a long way to get its act together. We've done more, I'm pleased to say. The latest escalation, as you may have seen, is that North Korea is now sending troops. When North Korean troops start getting killed in eastern Ukraine, I don't think this government or NATO has begun to wake up to the scale of the problem that that kind of bloc consolidation and the effect of the international politics of that kind of démarche is going to have. So I think we've really got to there's a degree of lack, I'm on the Defence Committee, there's a degree of lack of seriousness, lack of readiness across the whole of our defence and security establishment. Well, not the whole of it, but chunks of it. We've got to be, and political, we've got to be much more serious about this.
Sanctions are necessary but insufficient. So they're a good start, but Jesse is completely right. The West has agreed that Russia shouldn't win. It has not agreed how Ukraine will. We need to get far more serious about arming Ukraine properly. I don't believe for a minute that Putin would stop at the border of Ukraine if he is successful in winning that war. This is a war happening on our continent. And I've been delighted to see today that the Labour government has signed the Trinity House agreement with Germany.
We can see some pictures of this. This is the Anglo-German defence agreement.
I very much hope that they will also reboot the Lancaster House agreement that we have with France. It is, with everything we've talked about today, potential protectionism from Trump coming down the line to our west, the reaction of the BRICS to much of that protectionism, setting up their own version of the SWIFT payment system, potentially even their own currency. They're acting as a bloc. Where does that leave the UK? It leaves us outside of the EU, bobbing around in the mid-Atlantic with protectionism to our east and our west. It is absolutely vital that we align with Europe on standards and regulations and that we hug our European allies and liberal democracies closely.
Well, what do you say to Naomi? That we're the ones who are isolated, according to Naomi, not Russia.
I think Russia has too many friends in the world. That's absolutely true, but we have plenty of alliances as well, and one of them is being really forged with Germany at the moment. But can I just say something about the United Nations? Lots of people admire the United Nations. It sounds like a lovely organisation, but you've got the Secretary General of the United Nations who's at war with Israel, a nation that's defending itself, and that he's now going to Moscow, a country that invaded Ukraine, that is killing the Ukrainian people in a way that is, brought war back to Europe. The United Nations is not a good or a neutral player in the world, and the sooner we recognise it, the better.
Marie, do you agree with that?
Look, I think it's up to those individuals whether they attend the BRIC summit, and that isn't a matter for me. But what
you must have a view about it.
But what I will say, going back to the point that Naomi made, we've seen the Trinity Defence Agreement announced. I thoroughly welcome that. It means that steel made in Forge Masters in Sheffield will be used in creating the artillery barrel guns, which we know, when that is produced, will create 400 jobs. And we don't know quite where the Rheinmetall factory is going to be, but that's going to be really important, both to defence of our country. But seeing this close relationship growing between one of a senior European partner is really, really important. And just going back to the point on Ukraine, 120 million for the Maritime Capability Coalition. We're also putting in place a $2.5 billion loan for Ukraine, which will be paid back via Russian sanctions, and a further $3 billion a year to support them. And we're also training 45,000 troops here.
But it's still, is Putin winning? As a result of all of the work that is being done, he's being able to host this international conference. The world's food supply could be certainly under threat or tightened, and it's not enough to end this war with Ukraine. When you say they have to do more and arm Ukraine more, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about money. I'm talking about the whole of the West funding the Ukraine effort against Putin, this totalitarian, anti-democratic leader who is, we've seen it in Crimea in 2014, we saw lots of interference from Russia in elections. We've talked about that at the top of this show and other elections, but just at the weekend, Moldova reports of that interference. This is about the fundamental security of those who believe in the international liberal democratic order getting together and fighting this properly and helping Ukraine to do it. It is not solely Ukraine's war. It is all of us who want to see an end to that totalitarian creep from Moscow.
Look, we have to get real about this. This war between Russia and Ukraine is now like a World War I situation. It's a stalemate, and thousands of young Ukrainian and Russian lives are being lost. Now, I remember a BBC report that still haunts me now, a mother waiting in her home while Russian soldiers outside her home celebrated killing her son. You know, what Putin has done in that part of the world is beyond any kind of contempt. He's an evil man. And unfortunately, I hate the very prospect of it. But if we are to avoid more thousands of young people losing their lives, being wounded, some sort of deal has to be done. And it's a deal with the devil. I accept that. But further arming Ukraine, I just do not see where that will end other than in more and more violence and more death
do you
without
agree that
any real territorial adjustment.
Well, do you agree a deal has to be done? Of course, Donald Trump always claims that if he becomes president again, he will cut that deal.
My view is, if you think a deal has to be done, and I'm not by any means clear that one does, but if you think a deal, then you still want to rearm and support Ukraine so that it gets the best possible deal. The truth of the matter is that there is a fight for the whole of Europe. Yes. People now think that the borders with Poland, invaded so many times in the past, has gone to people. If what we're starting to see is a further escalation towards that, then we need to be taking it seriously across Europe and across NATO now.
What was the point of fighting World War II if we allow Putin to take control of Ukraine?
Let's go inside. Well, let's go into the chamber because Prime Minister's Questions is happening in about 5 minutes' time. It is actually going to be a meeting of the deputies. The Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, will be taking questions from Oliver Dowden for the Conservatives on the other side. We were talking about the Conservative leadership contest a few moments ago, and Kemi Badenoch, who is one of the candidates, said this about Angela Rayner.
If you look at when I was opposite Angela Rayner at our first meeting, I'd never actually spoken to her before. Despite what people might think, she is someone who I quite like just as a persona. She's obviously got very, very different politics from me, but we're all trying to deliver a better country.
What do you make of that? Support from Kemi Badenoch there for Angela Rayner.
I mean, I'd never thought I'd find myself saying this, but I agree with Kemi. Angela is an extremely warm, capable politician who I've met a number of times. And the fact that she brought the Employment Rights Bill before the House this week, something I was incredibly proud to make my maiden speech in that debate. And intriguing that Kemi does celebrate her, given that only recently she has denigrated maternity rights for women and also the living wage too, and that bill has strengthened those things. And Angela is a force of nature, and so seeing her take charge of that, and also what we plan to do in local government over the coming years to improve, that area is really important. So it's good to see Kemi be so generous to Angela.
Angela Rayner, an inspiration for the person that you would like to see as the next Conservative leader.
I think both are very strong women, and I rather admire both of them, frankly. And I think that's fantastic, and long may it go on.
Tim? What do you think of Angela Rayner? She has, of course, now been taken onto the National Security Committee. There had been some sort of slight reported by her staff as a result, but that's changed with the new broom at number 10, or running the Downing Street operations.
Look, I disagree with Angela Rayner on almost everything, I think. But what I like about her is that you sense when she speaks, she's telling you what she believes. Yeah. And in so many people in politics, you don't have that feeling. And authenticity. What is it they say? If you can fake sincerity, you've got it made. But no, I think she is real. And in a politician where you have so many people who are machine politicians, that matters. And she's a welcome contrast to Keir Starmer in that respect, who I think is very calculated in everything he says. And so I think they're a good double act, actually, politically.
Yes, do you agree? They complement each other in that sense, because she couldn't be more different, or he couldn't be more different to her.
To change the last half an hour or so, I do agree with Tim.
Oh, we got there. We got there in the end.
I think we need to have more people who have the same background as Angela in Parliament. Parliament would be a better place if there were more people like her in it.
And, of course, not long now for Rishi Sunak, because, of course, next week it'll be the budget it? I have got that right. It is next week, isn't it? Next Wednesday. So he'll be
Well,
responding.
Joe,
I know. I'm just keeping up with the dates. Keep up with the dates.
Yeah.
But yes, and that will be him standing down. It'll be the last time, of course, that he
That'll
will
be
appear at the
his
dispatch
last
box.
hurrah.
What would you say about Rishi Sunak now at this point, as he prepares to depart as Conservative leader?
I think one would have to say it's been a mixed picture. I think the calling of the election, the timing of that, I think some of the ways in which the government conducted itself for the last year or so, you know, I mean, I think he's an honest, hard-working man, but I think not a particularly politically kind of adept one, and that slightly caught up. Right?
Yeah.
You say his last moment as Conservative leader. Maybe it's his last moment as an MP.
Do you think that?
Rumours
Do you
are
think
rife
that?
that he's going to step down as
He's always said he
MP.
won't.
He's always said he won't, but politicians haven't always said exactly what they intended to do in the past.
That's true.
I'd be surprised if he stayed in Parliament.
Would you?
Yeah.
OK, and those...
I think we'll be having our first by-election of the Parliament potentially quite soon.
Well, it is
North
interesting because
Yorkshire.
he has always said he would stay and not disappear to California, which is what's been predicted. What's interesting,
He
though...
didn't give up the green card, did he?
That I don't know. But, Marie, what's interesting is that still Keir Starmer, when he's standing at the dispatch box for Prime Minister's questions, refers to Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister. I think he did it again last week. I mean, old habits really do die hard, don't they?
Well, I mean, I've sat in the chamber for almost every one of the PMQs that we've had, and his delivery and his authority at the dispatch box is really impressive. And I think some of that is, you know, being someone that is always promoted being in the line of service and not, you know, thinking of themselves as being in positions of authority. I'm just getting over this idea that I might get Tim's quote that Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer are a great double act put on a T-shirt. So.
You can dial them up after the programme. Let me just show you this in The Guardian. Before we go into the chamber, this is from Pippa Creer, a political editor at The Guardian. Labour donor Lord Ali is found by Standards Commissioner to have breached Lord's Code of Conduct over registration of interests on 4 occasions. Minor technical breaches, so letter of apology recommended. What do you make of that, Marie? Of course, Lord Ali is the wealthy Labour donor who has paid for... Oh, too late. We're going into the chamber for PMQ.
Question 1, Mr Speaker. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I've been asked to reply. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, is in Samoa to discuss shared opportunities in the Commonwealth, including how we work together to deliver economic growth. With increasing threats facing Britain, it is vital that we also strengthen the defence, security and cooperation with our allies. And that's why today this government signed a landmark defence agreement with Germany, which will help keep us safe and create hundreds of jobs. Mr Speaker, I know the whole House will join me in sending our best wishes to Sir Chris Hoy and his wife Zara. He is a true sporting legend, and the courage and positivities they have shown will inspire many others. Mr Speaker, I also send our condolences to those affected by the train crash in Powys. Mr Speaker, this morning I have had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. For 14 years, my constituents in Newcastle-under-Lyme had to suffer flatlining wages, in-work poverty and a battered economy that served nobody. Can I urge the Deputy Prime Minister to use the Employment Rights Bill to turn the page on the last 14 years, to give our businesses the support they need, and to finally restore dignity, prosperity and opportunity to the good people of Newcastle-under-Lyme?
Can I thank my honourable friend and welcome my honourable friend to his place? When this government took office, we promised the biggest upgrade to workers' rights in a generation, a new deal for working people. We said that we would introduce a bill within the first 100 days, and we've kept that promise. This is a Labour government led by working people for working people.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Oliver Dowden.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I join the Deputy Prime Minister in paying tribute to the bravery of Sir Chris Hoy? He truly is an inspiration to us all. And I also echo her comments about the train crash in Powys. Mr Speaker, what is the Deputy Prime Minister's definition of working people?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, let me start by welcoming the honourable gentleman to his new place Today's our first exchange, Mr Speaker, since he pushed for a July general election. And if his own side hasn't offered him a peerage, I certainly would have. And Mr Speaker, the definition of working people are the people that the Tory party have failed for the last 14 years.
Oliver Dowden.
Well, the Deputy Prime Minister stood on a manifesto promising not to raise taxes on working people. It now appears she can't even define who working people are. So I'll give her another go. There are 5 million small business owners in this country. Are they working people?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't know how the shadow Deputy Prime Minister can stand there with a straight face when it was the small businesses, the working people of this country that paid the price of them crashing the economy, sending interest rates scoring. I think he needs to learn his own lessons in opposition.
Oliver Dowden.
Well, I think the whole House will have heard the Deputy Prime Minister disregard 5 million hard-working small business owners. These are the publicans, the shopkeepers, the family running a local cafe. None of those count as working people to her. Now, Labour gave a clear commitment not to raise national insurance. The independent IFS have given their view on this. They say that raising employer national insurance is a tax on working people. Even the Chancellor said that raising employer national insurance was a jobs tax that will make each new recruit more expensive and increase the cost to business. So does she agree with the IFS and her own Chancellor?
Mr Speaker, I remember the party opposite, what they said to business. What was it, F to business? Whereas this party held an international investment summit last week, which poured £63 million into our economy. We're pro-business, pro-worker and getting on with fixing the mess that they left behind.
So I think we can take it from that answer that the Deputy Prime Minister doesn't agree with the IFS. And I suppose it shouldn't come as a surprise that she doesn't agree with her Chancellor. But does she agree with this? And I quote, "Working people will pay when employers pass on the hike in national insurance." Mr Speaker, these are her words. So does she at least agree with herself?
Mr Speaker, what I'm incredibly proud of is this week, this government brought in a new employment bill, which will raise the living standards of 10 million workers. Would the shadow Deputy Prime Minister like to apologise for the hiking taxes, 70-year hiking taxes that he put on working people, the crashing of the economy and the disaster that he left behind?
Well, she mentions her policy. Let's be clear, it's a £5 billion hit to the British economy, and that's her own assessment. Mr Speaker, I think that following these answers, there will be millions of working people now even more worried about the tax rises coming their way in next week's budget. But as this is our last exchange across the dispatch box, I'd like to turn to somebody I hope we can all agree is a hard-working person, His Majesty the King. Yeah. Will she join me in sending him best wishes ahead of the Commonwealth Summit in Samoa? In particular, will she confirm that this government recognises the unique role played by the Commonwealth? And will she commit to deepening this relationship so that under His Majesty's leadership, we build upon possibly the greatest legacy of the late Queen?
Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister.
I will miss our exchanges. The battle of the gingers, the late nights voting. And in that spirit, Mr Speaker, I will agree with my right honourable friend. The King does a tremendous job, and so did the late Queen, and the Commonwealth is very important, and that's why the King and the Prime Minister at the moment are working together. Thank you.
Oliver Dowden.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for that answer. Our Commonwealth family is brought together by historical and cultural ties, indeed, much like the pair of us. But I will resist, Mr. Speaker, the temptation to replicate that. But as we look to the Commonwealth's future, we now have the opportunity to deepen our economic relationship. Will she therefore assure the House that the Prime Minister will use this summit to continue the work begun by the last government in building deeper economic ties with our Commonwealth friends and allies?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we talk about economics. The architect of the 2024 Tory general election campaign, doing his victory lap before retiring with the hereditary peers that he fought so hard to protect. He leaves behind a Tory party in utter denial, heads in the sand, refusing to accept the rejection by the British public. Their plan for Britain, Mr. Speaker, includes scrapping the minimum wage, cutting maternity pay and tax breaks for the big oil companies. Mr. Speaker, this Labour government is elected to end the Tory chaos.
Dr Evans, you've got a sore neck. I wish it was your throat a little. Come on, Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, they don't like to hear it, but this Labour government was elected to end the Tory chaos, and that's exactly what we're doing. £600 more in the pockets of insecure workers, 30,000 new dads given paternity leave, and 10 million working people better off. While their so-called leadership candidates argue about what went wrong, this Labour government is getting on with rebuilding Britain.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, like many MPs, have heard many heartrending stories of constituents who have had poor end-of-life support. Yet, had palliative care been available alongside an end-of-life plan, their experiences could have been so different. Would the Deputy Prime Minister agree to set up a commission for palliative and end-of-life care so that everyone can access the very best support when terminally ill and have a peaceful and dignified death, and will she meet to discuss it?
I thank my right honourable friend for raising what is an emotive subject on both sides of this House. I know from my own work in this area before I was in this place what an incredible work this is and the honour it is to be there for somebody at the end of their life. Discussions have begun now on how to improve access to palliative and end-of-life care, and I'll ensure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss this issue.
Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I associate myself and the Liberal Democrats with the Deputy Prime Minister's remarks about Chris Hoy and all those involved in the train crash. Our NHS is bracing itself for a winter crisis. And one of the causes of the winter crisis every year is that there are thousands of people in hospitals who are fit to go home, but they can't be discharged because there are not the care workers in place to enable people to recover at home or in a care home. Would the Deputy Prime Minister consider the Liberal Democrats' idea of an NHS winter task force to winter-proof our NHS, end this cycle of the winter crisis and put to an end the scandal of hospital patients paying the price of the social care crisis left by the Conservatives?
I thank the honourable lady for her comments, and I share with her her desire to ensure that care workers are given the respect and the importance that they deserve. They are critical, in my opinion, to solving the problems within our National Health Service, and it's the Labour Party that will create a national care service, and we're launching our first ever fair pay agreement for care professionals to boost recruitment and retention. We must get the NHS back on its feet after the disaster of the Conservatives, and my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will have more to say in the budget.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her answer. We stand ready as a party of constructive opposition to work with the government to fix our social care system. However, one of the measures that could make it harder for us to keep the carers that we so desperately need would be an increase in employers' national insurance contributions. Were that measure to go ahead, it would affect millions of small businesses, including 18,000 small care providers. Can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister to assure this House that there will be nothing in the budget that makes it harder for vulnerable people to access the care workers and the care that they desperately need?
Well, again, I won't speculate on the budget, not least with the Chancellor that sat at the side of me. But what I will say, and I'll reiterate what the Chancellor has said and what the Prime Minister has said, this will be a budget that recognises that working people of this country and the enterprise in this country has been hard hit by the 14 years of Conservatives. We will rebuild Britain and we will grow our economy to pay for our public services.
Chris MacDonald. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This next year marks the 200th anniversary of the Stockton to Darlington Railway, but the rail industry in my area is currently in peril, with hundreds of jobs at risk at Hitachi Rail as a consequence of a lack of action from the previous government. Will my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, join me and our honourable friend, the member for Newton Aycliffe and Spennymoor, with workers, management and trade unions to ensure that no stone is left unturned as we fight for the future of this Hitachi Rail factory?
I thank my right honourable friend for that question and welcome him to his place. He's been a champion for workers at Newton Aycliffe from day one. And I know he's met with the Transport Secretary, and I can assure him that we're in close contact with Hitachi on operations to secure a sustainable future for Newton Aycliffe. And we're committed to a long-term industrial strategy for rolling stock, seeking to support British manufacturing and end the volatility of recent years.
Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In today's spirit of cross-party working, will the Deputy Prime Minister join me in applauding the brave Labour staff members who've travelled across the Atlantic to campaign against Donald Trump?
Mr. Speaker, I'm loving this loving. I don't often get it. But I say to the honourable gentleman is that people in their own time often go and campaign, and that's what we've seen. It happens in all political parties. People go and campaign and they do what they want to do in their own time with their own money.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many in my constituency of Cowdenbeath and Kirkcaldy, my family knows what it means to raise and support a disabled child. Charities like the Yard in Kirkcaldy do an amazing job providing vital additional help to disabled children and their families. Last month, a survey found that our country is so broken that 3/4 of parents of children with special educational needs and disabilities have been forced to give up work or cut their hours. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree that our Labour government must tackle this intolerable reality?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend and pay tribute to those that work with children with special educational needs and disabilities. I myself have my amazing son who does tremendously well given his challenges that he faced in life. I know from personal experience the system is just not working for children and families. Future funding decisions will need to be taken as part of the upcoming spending review, Mr. Speaker, but we will work with the sector to deliver our shared mission and restore parents' trust.
Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just 3 months into this Labour government, we have seen brutal cuts to support for pensioners. We have seen the taxing of education, and we have seen just this week £5 billion of additional pressure put on British businesses. Why does this government have such a problem with aspiration?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member might not have been in this place, and I welcome him to his place now during the last Parliament, but it was his government that left a £22 billion black hole. It was his government that left us with the biggest housing crisis. It was his government that crashed the economy, and it was his government that saw interest rates, inflation go to 11%, where pensioners were worse off than they are now.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Deputy Prime Minister, I watched in horror and condemned the act of October the 7th by the terrorist group Hamas. A year later, I watched in horror as 42,000 people are killed in Gaza, 11,000 of them children. People burned alive, attached to drips, aid workers killed, and now families are starving. Our right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has said that the world will not stand by and see this the lack of humanitarian assistance. If the Israeli government will not listen to our Prime Minister's words, what tangible, measurable actions will we take as a UK British government?
I thank my honourable friend for raising this really serious and important issue. The humanitarian situation in northern Gaza, Mr Speaker, is dire, and we need an immediate ceasefire and much more aid allowed to flow in and an immediate release of all the hostages. We have suspended UK export licences to Israel for items which might be used in the current conflict, and this government has concluded that there is a clear risk that items exported to Israel might be used in serious violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza. This does not change our position, Mr Speaker, instead support for Israel's security, but we will always do so in a manner consistent with our obligations to domestic and international law.
David Simmons.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our child protection services have had to deal with a number of cases where parents and carers have argued that their fatal actions were lawful punishment. So I'd like to ask the Deputy Prime Minister, will she bring forward legislation bringing the rest of our country into line with Scotland and Wales so that all children enjoy unambiguous protection in law against violence?
I think it's a very important point that the right honourable gentleman raises, and I'll make sure that the Minister has a meeting with him. But the first job of any government is to protect the citizens, and that includes our children, and we'll make sure we work across the House to deliver that.
Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last Friday was International Menopause Day, and the government announced Mariella Frostrop as the new Menopause Employment Ambassador. Mariella will be working across Whitehall to ensure every department recognises the need to support women through their menopausal years. Hopefully, Mr Speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister will join me in celebrating this appointment and confirm that this government will do all they can to keep menopausal women happy, healthy and wonderful.
Absolutely, Mr Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for all of her work in this area. This government will boost protections for women experiencing menopause symptoms at work, and I'm proud that we've appointed Mariella Frostrop as the new Menopause Employment Ambassador. She is a powerful champion who will work with employers across the country to raise awareness, improve workplace support for women and help them stay in work and progress in their careers.
Monica Harding.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Charlie from my constituency of Esher and Walton is an 8-year-old boy with an autism diagnosis who has been out of school for almost a year. He is one of 1,800 children in Surrey missing school because of a lack of appropriate special educational needs provision. Will the government commit to ending this scandal by properly funding special educational needs provision in next week's budget so that children like Charlie in my constituency of Esher and Walton and beyond are no longer let down?
I thank the honourable member for her very important question, and I'm sorry to hear about what Charlie and many other children with special educational needs have gone through. We know we've inherited a really dire situation. Many members across this House have raised this issue, and that I'm sure the Chancellor have heard what she said and that she will be upcoming in the budget.
Mike Tuck.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This morning we woke to more tragic news of deaths in the Channel, something that we're hearing far too often. Just last month we saw the death of a pregnant woman and children, Mr Speaker. I'd like to ask the Deputy Prime Minister what this government is doing to take on the evil smuggling gangs who are trading in human misery.
I thank my honourable friend and welcome him to this place and his expertise within the National Crime Agency. And he knows that we inherited an asylum system in chaos. And as he quite rightly says, these are people, women, children. We are putting in place a credible plan to protect our borders and remove those with no right to be here by setting up our Border Security Command, backed by £75 million of investment, and we're working with our international partners to target and disrupt the criminal smuggling gangs.
Father of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
Will the government please continue to work closely with West Lindsey District Council and myself
to ensure that RAF Scampton is sold off in a timely fashion at a fair price, so that we secure the future of the runway, the spaceport and the Heritage Centre, rather than maximise value and cover it with housing?
I thank the honourable member, the Father of the House, for his question. My right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, is taking urgent action to clear the backlog of cases, reducing the use of asylum accommodation and saving millions for the taxpayers. And I will ensure that the right honourable member is kept fully updated as the decommissioning disposal process of Scampton is followed.
Dave McHillier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my constituency, hundreds of leaseholders, tenants and shared owners are living in properties with cladding and other defects in their properties, and thousands around the country. Their lives are on hold. Many are facing bankruptcy, delaying having children unable to move. We've had another change in ministerial responsibility. Will the Deputy Prime Minister take a personal lead on keeping on top of this? Because after the years since Grenfell, they're still living in limbo and need some hope of change.
I thank my honourable friend for this really important question. And I say from the outset, the pace of remediation has been too slow. And I do take a personal lead in this. 7 years on from the Grenfell Tower tragedy, it is unacceptable that so many buildings still have unsafe cladding. I'm meeting with developers, mayors, regulators and national building safety bodies to press the urgency of this work. And I will make sure action is being taken to make sure that homes are safe.
Helen Morgan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Shropshire's farmers have been suffering from flooding following 18 months of incredibly wet weather, topped off last Wednesday by in 24 hours by the month's worth of rain. They weren't eligible for the Farming Recovery Fund, and a Freedom of Information request by Farmers Weekly found that only £1.2 million of that £50 million has been handed out to farmers. Will the government consider extending the eligibility of that scheme so that we can keep farmers going when they're deluged by floodwater?
Well, I'm really sorry to hear the plight of the Shropshire farmers, and we inherited a flood defence programme in disrepair. Thanks to 14 years of mismanagement and failure, communities are unprotected and families and businesses are forced to pay the price. We launched a flood defence task force to turbocharge the delivery and coordination of flood defences, and we're investing in £1.5 billion this year to scale up flooding national resilience. And I'll make sure she gets a meeting with the Minister.
Anna Dixon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has delivered on its manifesto commitment to introduce the Employment Rights Bill in its first... This includes a historic fair pay agreement for care workers and will benefit all those who care for older and disabled adults like those in my constituency of Shipley. Will the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that care workers deserve pay and conditions that match the amazing work they do to support our loved ones to have a fulfilling life?
I thank my honourable friend and welcome her to her place. As a biased former care worker, I'll always champion carers and the complex quality and professional work that they do. I absolutely agree that care workers deserve the pay and conditions to match their enormous contribution to our community, and I'm proud to say that we're delivering that fair pay agreement that will give the carers the recognition that they deserve, and will make sure that those carers are able to deliver the best possible care to our loved ones.
James McCleary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, a widely reported study from Aston University Business School showed that UK goods exports to the EU are 27% down and imports 32% lower than they would otherwise have been, thanks to the Conservatives' failed Brexit deal. Will the Deputy Prime Minister tell me what steps this government is taking as part of their reset with the EU to cut Brexit red tape for small businesses to help our economy get growing again?
Well, I welcome the right honourable member to his place, and he's right to advocate for small businesses. They are the backbone of our economy. This government is turning the page on the relationship with Europe, reinvigorating alliances and forging new partnerships rather than reopening the divisions of the past. We will improve the UK's trade and investment relationship with the EU, tearing down unnecessary barriers to trade. This will not involve rejoining the single market, customs union or reintroducing freedom of movement, but we will get that relationship better.
Rachel Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 27,000 people in the cities of London and Westminster live in the private rented sector. After 14 years of neglect and delay, they face damp and mould in their homes, they risk no-fault eviction and out-of-the-blue rent hikes. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that the Renters' Right Bill currently in committee will transform life for private renters and finally rebalance power between tenants and landlords?
I thank my honourable friend and I welcome her to this place. And I'm incredibly proud of the Renters' Rights Bill that we're pushing through Parliament, because too many renters are being exploited by a minority of unscrupulous landlords unable to challenge bad practices because they could be evicted at any moment. The party opposite shunters, they promised the electorate this, they failed to deliver. We will deliver.
Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Communities across the country, including in Bedfordshire, recently experienced widespread flooding. The village of Malden in my constituency has experienced an increase in flooding following cumulative housing development. As the Deputy Prime Minister requires communities across the country to build more homes, will she also ensure that those new developments do not increase flooding risk?
Again, I thank the honourable member for raising and also welcome him to his place. We recognise the devastating impact flooding can have. I know the flooding minister visited Bedfordshire in September to meet with volunteers and residents. We inherited flood defences that are in disrepair and behind schedule. We've launched a flood resilience task force, and when it comes to the planning reforms, Mr. Speaker, needed to deliver the 1.5 million homes this country needs, we will ensure that the right infrastructure is in place and communities are resilient.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Zoe's Place in the West Derby area of Liverpool is a hospice providing support to sick children and their families. It's been threatened with closure, has to find £5 million by the end of the year. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that hospices like these need to be on a statutory footing and not reliant on charitable funding?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and the hospice situation in this country has faced significant challenges because of the 14 years of devastation under the Conservatives. The Health Secretary has already raised these issues and knows that this is of importance, and I'll make sure she gets a meeting.
Final question, Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Deputy Prime Minister will know that my constituency and Lincolnshire as a whole is the breadbasket of Britain, producing 12% of the food that's consumed across the entire nation, 30% of the vegetables, 20% of the sugar beet and so on. She will know that's because of the Grade 1 and 2 land in Lincolnshire. And yet Lincolnshire faces an invasion of giant pylons down the east coast and huge solar developments. So will she meet a delegation of colleagues from Lincolnshire and nearby, including my honourable friend for Louth and Sleaford and the Fardville Hills, so that we can establish that energy security must never be the competitor with food security.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, and he will know that we launched a consultation on the National Planning Policy Framework. We will protect agricultural land. We will ensure that we have renewable energy, so we have energy security in this country, and we will get Britain building again.
That completes Prime Minister's questions, and let the front benches change over.
And that does indeed bring us to the end of this week's Prime Minister's Questions with the deputies, Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, and the Shadow Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, because Keir Starmer is abroad away for that Commonwealth Summit meeting and completing a very long flight. Let me introduce our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the government, we have Chris Bryant, Culture Minister. For the opposition, for the Conservatives, Gareth Davis, Shadow Treasury Minister, and Henry Zeffman, who appeared earlier on in the programme. He's back by popular demand, the BBC's chief political correspondent. Welcome to all of you. It was unsurprising, I suppose, a week out from the budget. Ongoing speculation about what will be in it. We're told it's going to be big and consequential, which it probably will be. And so the questions from Oliver Dowden certainly centred on this row about whether or not Rachel Reeves, who is sitting alongside Angela Rayner, is going to increase employer national insurance contributions, despite saying in the manifesto during the election campaign that there'd be no increases in taxes on working people. Did we learn anything new?
No, I don't think so. But what Angela Rayner didn't do is take the opportunity to dispel what increasingly feels like the worst-kept secret in Westminster, which is that something is happening to employers' national insurance. It may not be the main rate that goes up. It may well be that employers come to be taxed more on their pension contributions to employees' pensions. But something is happening there, because otherwise I don't understand why the government would have taken the hit, and I think it is that, of making the argument that what a lot of people, though not everyone, read into their manifesto actually wasn't there after all.
Right. I mean, who is a working person was the question that Oliver Dowden put to Angela Rayner. How difficult is it going to be to answer questions about what you meant in the manifesto if it does turn out that national insurance contributions for employers go up, or something increases in terms of employer national insurance contributions?
Now, my two favourite words that you've used, Jo, are speculation and if.
I think I used speculation earlier and only if in this question.
Just came into this one. But basically, we're speculating.
Yeah.
And I'm never quite sure what the value of speculation is. I know that there are people who don't like the term working people, because people kind of want to go, well, am I not a working person?
Yeah, well.
And I understand that. But it's become a shorthand in political circles, hasn't it? For the people who were particularly disadvantaged in the cost of living crisis because of inflation at one point running at 11%, and on top of that then you had that moment when Liz Truss basically crashed the economy. We had the biggest problem for my constituents and for most ordinary families in my patch, where 72% or so own their own home and have mortgages, was that mortgage rates went up, not just significantly, but they went up very, very fast, faster than they've ever done in our history.
Right.
And that suddenly meant that people had to find an extra £300 a month.
Well,
for their mortgages.
Right,
so those are the people that we didn't want to hit. So we wanted to say in the general election, we don't want to take more tax from you. And that's what we said. And just, I know there's Gareth's probably about to say, oh,
well, let him say it.
You didn't rule this out.
Can you read his mind?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, right.
Because I can see his notes. I don't need to read his mind.
I wouldn't read them out if I were you, right?
No,
all right.
Listen, Gareth, I wouldn't if I were you either.
Right, well, let Gareth respond.
But the simple point is just about, so people are making the argument that we have somehow, if we do go forward with some changes to employers' national insurance, that somehow we misled people. The Tories in the general election tried to draw us on this time and time and time again, as did lots of journalists.
Well, what they did successfully was force the government to actually rule out raising any of the main taxes. But Gareth, what do you say in response to
Well, first thing is, I apologise for having notes. It's just that Labour have broken so many promises already in 100 days. I have to write them all down to be able to remember them. But rest assured, I think the British public will remember this at the next election. The issue here is that consumer and business confidence have been hit to a 3-month low because of the, speculation around the budget, and Chris is absolutely right. He can't speculate on what is or isn't in the budget because he doesn't know what's in the budget. Only Rachel Reeves will know what's in it. But not being able to rule out what was in the manifesto, I think, is what is hurting businesses and what is concerning businesses right now.
It wasn't in our budget.
Well, hang on. Well, that aside, what about the consequence that Gareth says as a result of this, which is business investment? He thinks has been affected by it. That is damaging.
Well, I think the point he's making is that people are anxious about what's going to happen in the budget, and it's certainly true that it's taken us a long time to get to a budget. Now, there is a specific and I think a good reason for that, which is that we wanted to make sure that we provided to the Office of Budget Responsibility the full amount of time that they needed to be able to look at all the numbers.
Although
and that
you
was
announced,
the flaw.
Interestingly, the winter fuel payments being cut.
Yes, because that was in this year. Right. And we needed... Look, the truth of the matter is, I know from the two departments that I sit in, Department for Culture, Media, Sport and the Science, Innovation and Technology, in both of them, government ministers, before the general election, made all sorts of promises about what they were going to do, and there wasn't a single penny set aside to deliver those. Right. And that's the kind of mess that we're trying to sort out.
The budget will happen next week, next Wednesday, and of course we will be bringing it to you live and uninterrupted. Let's talk about a different story, Henry, one that we did cover with you earlier in the programme, but let's return to it. Now we have our Minister and Shadow Minister here, and that is the claims of interference being made by the Donald Trump campaign, interference in the US presidential election by the Labour Party.
Yeah, and made those claims in a legal filing, so that confers a certain element of seriousness to this, even if the Labour Party believes that these claims should not be taken seriously at all. It all stems really from a LinkedIn post social networking site, particularly for people to make sort of work connections. It was posted by an organiser employed by the Labour Party who was saying that she had already arranged for around 100 or so Labour Party officials, past and present, to go and campaign in crucial swing states in America, and that she had space for a few more and that she could fix things up for them. Now, that post went viral in certain American circles and led the Trump campaign and their lawyer to say that they think there's a reasonable inference that those people were essentially being funded to do this work, something which is not permitted under American election law. Speak to the Labour Party, they said that's categorically not the case. I think privately they acknowledge that some of the phrasing does give rise to that inference, but they say absolutely not. These are Labour Party people, but acting in their personal capacity, doing what a lot of people would imagine people on the centre-left in the UK want to do, which is get someone on the centre-left in the US elected as president.
Let me just show you the head of operations at the Labour Party's LinkedIn post, which has subsequently been deleted. That line, Chris Bryant, I have 10 spots available for anyone available to head to the battleground state of North Carolina. We will sort your housing. Email me if you're interested. Is this problematic?
I don't think it is. It's perfectly standard. We've been doing it, all political parties, in fact, as you heard from the SNP in Prime Minister's questions, have been engaging in elections in other countries for years. None of the people concerned have been paid by the Harris campaign. I think the accommodation has been provided by individual members of the Democrat Party. We are sister parties. I remember going to the 1993 Spanish elections because it was no socialist had won any elections in Europe for years and years and years, and I kind of wanted to know how they were doing it. So I think it's perfectly standard. And of course, Liz Truss and Nigel Farage have both gone to help Donald Trump. Fine. Right, I'm chilled about it.
Right, well, let's get Sarah Elliott, who's from Republican Overseas. Welcome to you, Sarah. It's perfectly standard. I don't know if you heard Chris Bryant, the minister here with us, saying that this has gone on time immemorial.
Yes, it's not common, at least with Republicans coming over here to campaign. And can you imagine if Donald Trump sent 100 activists to come campaign for the Tories in the last general election? There'd be a huge upheaval and everyone would be aghast at that. I don't think it's commonplace. We'll have to see what the FEC says, if it breaks any kind of federal election rules. But I can tell you that an American would not like hearing from someone with a British accent on their doorstep on how to vote.
Well, Chris, Brian.
Well, that's another matter, isn't it? Whether it's successful or not is quite a different matter. The question is whether it's legitimate or not. And my memory is that I remember Alan Duncan, when he was a Conservative minister, I think, went to the United States, I think in the end actually to help the Democrats rather than the Republicans. But I'm certainly aware of lots of Republican advisors who've come to the UK to help advise the Conservative Party over the years.
Yes, I mean, that is true, Sarah Elliott. There have been many advisors coming over from the United States, and there are also Conservative activists who have in the past gone out to help campaign for both Republicans and, more recently, Democrats too. So what's the problem?
Well, it's the appearance of favoritism, right? So we have a new Labour government. Keir Starmer and David Lammy have gone to great lengths to put out olive branches to Trump team, and have David Lammy spoke at the Hudson Institute, called himself a small C conservative like J.D. Vance. Keir Starmer just had dinner with Donald Trump in New York, but we're dealing with a presidential candidate who may just be elected in 2 weeks' time as president again, who takes things very personally when you choose a side against him. Right. And I think this is damaging for a future relationship between Keir Starmer's government and Donald Trump, even though we know the Prime Minister did not order that these activists go, but these are Labour activists. And we can tell that the Trump campaign cares about this based on their press release and their FEC filing.
All right, and we'll come actually to the wording of the legal letter, the complaint that's been made. But is that the important point, Chris Bryant? It's dealing with a presidential candidate like Donald Trump and his reaction to what may have been standard practice that could be very damaging for the Labour government.
Well, all these people are going under their own steam. They're paying for themselves. They're not being paid by anybody. So that's number one. Number two, I remember I was a Foreign Office Minister for 14 years ago. Excuse me. And I remember we often had to deal with
Have you got water there? Yeah.
I have. 14 years ago, and we had to deal with governments who weren't necessarily the same political flavour of us, and that is what grown-ups do. And whatever the personal sensitivities of individuals at either end of the equation, just as Keir Starmer has got on phenomenally well with the Italian Prime Minister, just so I'm absolutely sure that whoever gets elected in the United States of America in 2 weeks' time, we will have a strong working relationship, because it's about our two countries, not in the end about the two individuals.
Right. Gareth, what do you think? Is this just about Donald Trump perhaps not being grown up in a sort of broad characterisation of what Chris Bryant has said, and this is pretty standard practice? It's controversy for controversy's sake.
So the first thing to say is it is normal practice for individuals to have a relationship overseas, and that is a healthy thing, I think, between the two strongest allies in the world. The issue with this is that this is genuinely unprecedented for somebody who could be president in 2 weeks' time to put together a legal filing accusing their main ally of electoral interference. And I think the difference here is that it was, in appearances that it was organised by the head of operations by the Labour Party in a post which has now been deleted. So if there's nothing wrong with it, why was the post deleted? But even if it was okay, the reality is that when you're in government, you have to work with whoever is President of the United States. And we have clearly, as a country, now upset somebody who could be the next President of the United States. And that is bad, not just for the Labour Party, but it's bad for our entire country.
Chris?
Whatever happens in a fortnight's time, we're all going to have to work hard to maintain a strong working relationship on all the key issues that matter to our two countries. I am intrigued about the issue of real genuine attempts to political interfere, because actually the big story of this week is probably Russia in Moldova, and Russian interference in political elections in other places in Europe, in northern Macedonia and Greece and Turkey and so on. I mean, these are really significant attempts to undermine the democratic process. This is us engaging in the democratic process, and as Gareth says, I think it's good that lots of people want to go and see how a different political system works and to take part in it. Whether they'll make a decisive difference in a very tightly contested election, I think is unlikely.
Well, let's talk to Nigel Farage. I think he can hear us. He's in Central Lobby, the leader of Reform UK. Nigel Farage, I don't know if you've been listening to the conversation that we've been having about the claims by the Donald Trump campaign of electoral interference by the Labour Party. But you have been to campaign on behalf of Donald Trump many times, haven't you?
That's right, but I didn't go as part of a British government. I didn't go on behalf of a political party. I wasn't paid for. Well, I went as an individual. And, when I stood on the stage in 2016 at that big election rally, I said as a foreigner, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I talked in general terms about Brexit, about the fact pollsters can be wrong.
Right,
so
but it was clear you were backing Donald Trump.
Yeah, but
hang on, just to be clear, when you say you weren't part of a party, you were in the past going there when you were part of UKIP or part of the Brexit Party, and the Labour government have said this is a party matter and no one is being funded. So what's the difference?
Well, as I say, I never went on behalf of UKIP. I went purely as an individual. Mm-hmm. And here's the point.
Yeah.
The reason there's a problem is Federal Election Commission laws, which very clearly state anyone can go, and you're absolutely right, and they can speak and they can do whatever they want to do, but that it cannot be paid for. And the advertisement that was put out said you'll get free accommodation. There was no mention that people would have to pay their own airfares. There was absolutely no mention that they would have to pay, take time off work.
Yes.
And that's where the breach is.
Right. I mean, the alleged breach, as you are putting it, because the Labour Party has said that it isn't funded by them. People are going under their own steam. It was a sort of organisational matter, and the reference, they say, to housing being sorted would be staying with other activists and volunteers out in the States. So if that is the case and there is no funding involved, would you agree this is normal standard practice? You've done it, they've done it.
No. They're backtracking. Read the advert.
I've read it. We've read it a few times.
Does it say you've got to pay your own airfare? No. Does it say you've got to pay for your own accommodation? No, it says it'll be free. Does it say you're doing it in your own free time? No, it absolutely does not.
All right.
So now it may be, it's possible, I grant you, that it was incredibly badly worded.
Yes.
That is possible, I grant you that, but under the strict rules of the FEC, the Democrats are in breach of American electoral law for accepting this support. It's just as simple as that.
Well, we've got Chris Bryant here in the studio. Chris.
So they did go under their own steam. I just want to ask a question, Nigel. My understanding is that your flight this year was paid by other people, and you've had £30,000 of support to go to support Donald Trump, haven't you?
Nigel Farage, have we lost communication to you?
Can you just repeat
Chris, would you repeat that question?
Repeat what Chris said?
Yes, sorry, Nigel. My understanding, and you'll correct me, I'm sure if I'm wrong, is that you went earlier this year to support Donald Trump in an election year, and you had your flight and your expenses covered, and you've had £30,000 worth of support for you in going to support Donald Trump, isn't that? Or have I got that wrong?
Well, you get things very often wrong when it comes to me and money, so we'll be careful.
Well, come on then, clear up.
I went purely at the last minute. I went in a purely personal capacity to offer my support after the first.
But did you pay for your own flight?
No, I hopped on somebody else's plane. They gave me a free lift, but I didn't, which I declared. But I didn't go. I didn't campaign at all, actually. Didn't campaign at all. I went purely in a personal capacity as a friend of him and the family. That's very, very different.
Right, but when we are talking as we are about what has been done in the past, if we put, let's say it is a badly worded document, that LinkedIn post that has been subsequently deleted, but it was badly worded, the funding is aside, would you agree there is nothing to see here?
If the Labour Party and the FEC accept that it was badly worded, then yes. But as it stands, it is in clear breach.
Well, as I say, we will follow this up with the Labour Party. How much is this, Nigel Farage, to do with the character of Donald Trump? Somebody who, as we've just heard from Sarah Elliott from Republicans overseas, is someone who is rather sensitive, who takes offence if you're not with him or against him. What do you make of that?
Sensitive? The Democrats for 8 years have openly lied. The Russia hoax, that Russia was engaged, well, of course, in Brexit too.
Yeah, but answer my question about Donald Trump.
No.
But I'm asking you about... You know him. You know him. You're a friend.
If you spend 8 years accusing a man of breaking the law when you can't provide a single shred of evidence to back it up, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when you get something back in kind.
Nigel Farage, thank you very much from Central Lobby. Is this actually going to become a more problematic issue than perhaps it is now, although it is at the moment something that they're obviously going to have to think about in terms of response?
I think the big question here, Jo, is whether, as senior Labour people believe, this is merely Donald Trump having a pop at Kamala Harris and using the Labour Party as collateral. If so, then this will pass in a couple of days. It's Donald Trump with a campaign tactic in the final 2 weeks of the campaign. However, if those senior Labour people are wrong and actually this is genuine anger from a former president and possible president-elect within 2 weeks who does genuinely believe that the Labour Party was assisting his opponents, well, then potentially it could become a much more serious problem for this government, who have invested, as Sarah Elliott was saying, so much time and energy in making friends with Trump himself and senior people in Trump world.
We're going to move on and talk about something completely different. I want to show you this headline in The Times. Shield armed police from prosecution demands the Met Chief being Mark Rowley. We are expecting a statement from the Home Secretary, probably in the next hour or so, from Yvette Cooper. She is going to be responding about an investigation and a review into how police officers who take fatal shots in the line of duty are held to account. It was initially launched by the previous government, but it will be completed by her. Now, it also, of course, follows the acquittal of the firearms officer, Martin Blake, who had stood trial for the murder of Chris Cabba. But Mark Rowley now saying that the law should be changed. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, I want to see us review it, as the previous government was intending to do, and we're going to follow that through, because it's a perfectly legitimate question. How do you make sure that the police have the powers that they need to protect us all? But also, how do you make sure that the police aren't above the law? Perfectly legitimate question, and I think we should approach it with clear minds. The one thing I'm very reluctant to do is to try and tell prosecuting authorities where they should or shouldn't prosecute, or for that matter, what juries should or shouldn't, conclusion they should or shouldn't come to. Because in the end, that our system is based on independent system. Politicians shouldn't be telling prosecutors when to prosecute.
Right, so the system's working, isn't it? I mean, is there a real need to change the law if, just as you have outlined, this did go to trial and the police officer was prosecuted and he was acquitted by a jury? So is there a need for the law to be changed?
Well, maybe not, but so we should review. We should just review. We should look at get all the evidence out there, listen to different sides of the argument, and just make sure that we've got that balance right. That's the simple thing that we're trying to do. Of course, the Crown Prosecution Service, when they take a prosecution, have to make two decisions. First of all, whether it's in the public interest to prosecute, and secondly, whether there's more than a 50% chance of securing a conviction. Now, obviously, you know, they would have considered those matters before they took the prosecution in this case.
Do you think there's a sort of right for the law to be changed?
Well, I would agree, actually, with what Chris is saying. Our firearm officers have a particularly difficult job to do under very high-pressure circumstances. And so my personal belief is that the threshold for these cases should be high, but it's important to review it when incidents like the Chris Cabba case happen.
Well, except the review is already underway.
It was, but I think it is important that we constantly review this situation because of the, you know, quite unique circumstances in which these police officers find themselves on a continual basis.
Right, Mark Rowley has said no police officer is above the law, but said the force had been clear. The system holding police to account is broken. He says, I worry about the lack of support officers face for doing their best, but most of all, I worry for the public. The more we crush the spirit of good officers, the less they can fight crime. Do you agree?
Well, I think, look, as I said, they have a particularly challenging job to do. The threshold should be high, given their unique job in very high-pressure circumstances. It is important that we review it and we look at the conclusion of that review.
Should he have been prosecuted, this firearms officer, then, in the first place, when you listen to what Sir Mark Rowley said? Because in terms of the threshold being high, we've tried to look at the numbers. And over the last 2 years, in England and Wales, it looks as if there have been 3 fatal shootings by firearms officers. So I suppose relatively small, but still, you know, significant, and this one prosecution. So is the balance right on the basis of the numbers that we've had over the last few years?
So sometimes it's difficult to draw big conclusions from very small numbers, because one individual case may, for one set of reasons or another, be inspire a lot of emotional feelings in different directions, and that may skew your long-term evidence base. In the end, I'm only interested in evidence-based policy, not policy-seeking evidence, and it is difficult when you have such small numbers. You asked me a direct question, do I think this prosecution should have gone ahead? As I said earlier, I don't believe politicians should be saying whether a prosecution should go ahead. We put in place the expectations for the Crown Prosecution Service. As I said earlier, 2 things. Is it in the public interest to pursue a prosecution? And secondly, whether there's more than a 50% chance of getting a conviction. The one thing, of course, they can never factor in is what the view will be of the jury when they see all of that.
Well,
that's the bit I'm always hesitant about criticising what a jury has done or hasn't done, because I've not sat in the room for all those hours and listened to the legal arguments.
I mean, on the other side, Neil Basu, a former Assistant Commissioner, you'll be familiar with him, from the Metropolitan Police, said there was a lack of confidence in the criminal justice system from black communities and within the police itself, including firearms officers.
And I think it's all very stretched. That's another part of the equation in this. The Crown Prosecution Service finances are stretched, as, for that matter, are the resources of the Metropolitan Police and others. But look, in the end, we all want the same thing, which is we want the police to be able to proceed without fear or favour. And I cannot imagine the difficult decisions, split-second decisions that individual officers are making. And of course, it's not that you want to give police officers leeway, but you want to make sure that they're in a legally certain place.
Robert Jenrick, one of the leadership contenders, whom you are backing, has come out and said it was wrong to prosecute this firearms officer. Do you agree with him?
Well, that's his position. As I say, I think the threshold should be high for these officers who face incredible decisions, as Chris said, in split-second moments.
He wants to be leader of the party.
He does, and I've not seen specifically what he said, but I will look at it.
That is what he said.
I personally taking the view that the threshold should be high, and in this case we have to respect the verdicts of the jury.
I'm not sure that we should set any great store by what people say in a leadership election at the moment.
Right, but is it responsible to say so?
No, it's not responsible.
Do you agree with that it isn't responsible to perhaps pronounce on something as serious as this when it's going to be reviewed by the Home Secretary?
I think people want to know what the leadership candidates think about things, and when they give a straight answer, we should respect that.
Just before we go, because we haven't got long, this headline, BBC News, Henry Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, will vote against assisted dying law. Well, people earlier were praising him for at least stating his view, but this is a free vote.
Yeah, and he didn't actually mean to state his view publicly. He said it privately to Labour MPs, and then it leaked out to the Times initially and then to us. I think it's a big intervention, most obviously because he's the Health Secretary, but also especially given that he's the Health Secretary, his reasons for deciding not to vote for it are that he doesn't believe the palliative care system is up to it. So I think that will be quite influential on MPs as they consider how to vote.
I know the closing seconds of the programme, and this is a very big question, but have you made up your mind about how you will vote?
I haven't actually, and you know, government ministers, we've been asked sort of to stick out of it.
Yeah.
There's part of me, I used to be a vicar, and I've held the hands of people as they died, and I've seen families desperate.
Which way will you vote?
Incredibly emotional subject, but I'll be voting against. But I want to see the detail of the bill.
That you'll be voting against. That's all we have time for. I'll be back tomorrow with more. Bye-bye.